Hi, we enter into Luke 22 today as Satan enters into Judas and the passion of Jesus according to Luke begins. If you haven't watched the introductory video to Luke 22 and 23, I encourage you to do so, where we go over some of the themes and the elements that make Luke's version of Jesus' passion and death different than the others in the Synoptics as well as in John. I went over briefly, I won't go over it again now, this overly simplistic comparison of each evangelist's purpose to highlight they're not just reporting facts or events, they're shaping the story to meet their own audience and their own purposes. And we'll see that in particular today as Matthew and Luke report inconsistently impossible ways in which Judas allegedly dies. So we'll see that in a minute. So we look at the shape of this section. This is one way to shape it. This is not the shape. And I noted last time a series of chiasms that are embedded in these various sections, and we'll go over those as we go. Today we're just looking at the first part of the scene, the preparation for the Passover, in two parts. The first part about Judas's conspiracy, and then the question of where to prepare the Passover. And as we do, we've been looking at the key words here. This introductory part simply has the words for betray, literally means to hand over. So that's the only key word there. And then we'll see the chiastic unit here about preparations for the Passover, and further on more chiastic units as we go. But one of the elements that's interesting to see here is how Luke has shaped his version of Judas's betrayal differently. This is just a version of the chart I showed last time that had Luke 22, 1 to 13. And what I've omitted here in the ellipses there in Mark and here in Matthew is the story of the woman who comes to anoint Jesus, which Mark has there and Matthew replicates there, but Luke has just placed back to chapter 7 at the house of Simon the Pharisee, or Simon the leper, depending upon whose version you're looking at there. And so in Mark and Matthew, Judas's response follows directly from that. And interestingly, similarly in John, where it's not an anonymous woman, but it's Mary, as in Mary and Martha, who anoints Jesus' feet in the situation of Lazarus. And it's there that Judas complains that money could have been sold, or the perfume could have been sold and given to the poor. So there it's shaped that Judas is a thief, and others it's in contrast to his unwillingness to provide forgiveness or compassion for the woman. But Luke has changed it altogether here to highlight who the leaders are in Judas's relationship with them. And as I noted last time in the introductory video, Jesus' opponents shift throughout this section, even in our immediate section. You can see also on the left side of the screen that it's the chief priests and the scribes who are looking for a way to put Jesus to death. We'll look at the translation details of that in a minute. But in a few verses down, Judas confers with the chief priests and what's misleadingly translated here as officers of the temple police. I translate as temple soldiers, and the scribes drop out of it. So even though it's the chief priests and the scribes who are seeking to get rid of Jesus, it's the soldiers and the chief priests whom he speaks to, presumably, although it doesn't say, because the soldiers have the physical power to be participating in an arrest in the way the scribes would not. But then we'll continue to see how this changes. But we don't see another question of the opponents until after the Last Supper and the arrest, and we see Jesus taken into control by these people. So we'll look at that more there. We can also, worth looking at how Judas is portrayed in Luke Acts overall, and none of the Gospels give us much background. When the situation arises for Judas to betray, it seems like it comes almost out of nowhere. Only John provides any background that Satan and Judas have some kind of relationship earlier than this immediate scene, and we won't look at John comparison here. But we saw only one reference in the description of the 12 named there, Judas Iscariot, quietly just noted, who became a traitor. And a word used uniquely to Luke there. And then we see our scene right here, named as one of the 12, and we'll see the ironies of that in a minute. And then at the arrest scene, again reminded that he's one of the 12, and he approaches Jesus with a kiss. So the sign of intimacy that is the sign of betrayal. But in Luke's second volume, Acts of the Apostles, we see the recollection of this, where he's described this way: Judas, who became a guide for those who arrested Jesus. So it's curiously described almost in a positive way. To be a guide is a good thing, but obviously a guide in evil here. And the emphasis that's unique to Luke, that he was numbered among us and there needs to be someone to replace him to complete the 12, which is mentioned there in chapter 1 and never again in the rest of Acts. What's inconsistent that we can see here is in the parenthetical in the translation, the Greek has no parentheses, so that's added here. Now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong he burst open in the middle and all his bowels gushed out. A piece of dark humor that is fitting to the kind of humor we see in Acts, much like Judas Eutychus falling out the window and Paul dusting him off and going back to speak until dawn. So there's a lot of dark, what I like to call Coen Brothers type humor in Acts of the Apostles, and we'll look at that when we get there. But this is inconsistent with the scene we see in Matthew 27:5-10 that you can see here on the screen, where he goes out and hangs himself, and then there's a dedication of the field where he hung himself. And obviously those can't both be true, and we have no basis for deciding if either of those are true, or if they're both literary characterizations to highlight you can't get away with evil. But there's no way to answer those particular questions. And so what we're also going to look at in our scene, and I'll leave this up as we go through, is that each of our verses here in 22:1-6 has an ironic echo either before, in most cases, or looking ahead. So I'm going to leave that up here as we begin to enter into the details of our passage today. So now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called Passover, and it's only mentioned one other time, and that's back in 2:41 and 42. So a number of these things, it's not like it's mentioned a bunch of times and I'm just picking one that happens to fit. It's mentioned at the beginning, and now it's mentioned at the end. And we're going to see a number of echoes of the beginning and the end. It won't be surprising that Luke 1 and 2 are echoed into these last chapters as well. As scholars have noted, historically, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was separate from the feast called Passover. As is with traditional, there'd be a religious feast in the sense of something celebrating the relationship between Yahweh and the people of God. And there's also something of the harvest, or the festival of the seasons of the land. So the unleavened bread is about spring, just like we'd see that Sukkoth and Pentecost are about different harvest things as well. So here they're merged, as was certainly the case by the time of Luke's Gospel. So Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we hear the chief priests and the scribes, as I was noting. And the scribes here, the first time we're seeing them since Jesus took on the scribes in chapter 20, verses 1 and 19, around the question of authority, and then they dropped out. And they play no role here. They're just accompanying the chief priests. And as I was showing in the question of opponents, it's the chief priests who stay in there before Pilate and Herod here in this context, and the scribes do not. So they're mentioned here, but not again. They're mentioned again in verse 66 and 23:10, but they play no active part in the story. So here's the first of the ironies: seeking, azetio, the seeking and finding theme. So they're seeking, and because of Satan and Judas, they're able to find. So seeking a way not to put Jesus to death. And much of this translation is simply wrong. The root verb anerao here literally means to take away. So there's no word for death there, and there's no word for Jesus. So they're looking for a way to take him away. And that leaves a little more suspense about how that would happen. Would they just simply remove him? Jesus already said he's going to be killed. We know that, but the disciples weren't listening, as we know. Were we listening? But if we haven't been listening carefully, at least in the immediate scene, there's a little suspense about what they're looking to do and how they would take him away. But they're afraid of the people. And there's a curious cause and effect question here. Are they seeking to take Jesus away because they're afraid of the people? Or have they not done it because they're afraid of the people? It's ambiguous in the Greek, and that's kind of interesting, because we'll see the people become a part of his opponents in a couple of places here. The elders of the people, and here the chief priests, rulers, and the people. So we'll have to look more closely at their relationship with the people there as we go. So we've seen already they were afraid of the people back in 2019. So with that little prologue, and notice what the literary aspects of what the writer is doing here. The narrator is giving us the time, is giving us a background into the conspiracy here of the chief priests and scribes, then into the question of Satan and Judas, apart from the chief priests and scribes, then back to them, and then it'll go back to Jesus and the others gathered for the festival. So a lot of tricky literary back and forth going on to shape the scene, and that's certainly part of Luke trying to show to his audience that he's an intelligent and good writer. So afraid of the people. So then Satan entered into Judas. And we've seen Satan a couple of times, but Jesus' struggle in the beginning was with the diabolos, translated the devil there, not Satanas, as you can see in my note down below. So whether that was in his struggle in the wilderness or in the seed parable, the devil taking it away, that was not the same word, although I find no basis in either of other scholars for distinguishing Luke's use of Satanas from diabolos here. They have different historical roots, but we don't need to go into that now. So Satan entered into Judas, and the irony there is, iserkoma here went into, is Jesus called the 12 and gave them power over all demons. So while there's the chief of the demons in Judas, we recall that Jesus had given them power over all demons to the 12, but Judas doesn't apparently have power over the demon who's inside him at this moment. So entered into Judas, and Judas is named out of nowhere. He's called Iscariot to distinguish us from the other Judas that was named there, and one of the 12. As I noted, we already saw earlier, and that's all we know about him. So at this point, we know nothing about his motivations. It's unlike Kazantzakis' Last Temptation of Christ, where we see a Judas who's disgusted with Jesus' apparent weakness from his perspective and why he won't take on the Romans with force. But we see no immediate reason here for Judas's betrayal, and it's not in response to the waste of the money from that perspective that I was mentioning from John. So we went away and conferred here, synolalasen here, ironically contrasting with who Jesus confers with Moses and Elijah. And that could hardly be more a direct contrast there between those who are leading to death and those who are leading people away from death and into a deeper relationship with the Creator God. So he's conferring with the chief priests and the temple soldiers. As I noted previous time, the strategos in the introductory video is really the word for soldiers or a military aspect. Police is completely anachronistic until the 19th century when the modern sense of urban policing began to take place, at least in the United States. So there were no police in the Roman world. There were simply soldiers, in this case temple soldiers, about how he might betray them. And although it's translated betray, the word here, paradidomai, is the ordinary word for handing over. So it can be the word used, as Paul used it in 1 Corinthians, what was handed on to me, I hand on to you, about, interestingly, the Last Supper. So in that sense, it's like tradition to hand something on. In this case, it's to hand over. And I want to highlight that because, of course, it's not that betray is wrong here, but it's the physical act of taking Jesus from being amongst his disciples and apostles and putting him among the chief priests and soldiers. And so they were greatly pleased, and one has to wonder, did they know about Judas in advance? Were they anticipating that there'd be a member of Jesus' group that would betray him? How would they know that? Where does this scene take place? How long was he gone? We were told the festival of the Passover was near, and as soon as the scene is over, then came the day. But we don't know how many days this is. Is it just 1 day? Is it 3 days? Is it a week? We don't know. And so would Judas have been missed? Would any of the others have wondered where he was? How much freedom do they have during the day to just go do what they were wanting to do? Or were they always around Jesus? All those questions are implied, but we have no answers because the text simply doesn't tell us. But wherever and however and whenever this meeting is taking place, we see that they rejoice at this. And perhaps it comes as a surprise to them. Lucky us! One of Jesus' own people is going to turn him over to us. Isn't that lucky for us? And so they agreed to give him money, literally to give him silver. Ironically recalling, and I didn't put that in here because I couldn't put too many things in here and have it fit, but the prohibition to carry any silver when Jesus sent them out in chapter 9, and the Pharisees described as silver lovers in chapter 16, and in the parable about the man who is ruling against the will of his people and gives people money to make more money, that was imperial investment of silver there. As Green notes below, Judas may be influenced by Satan, but he has also fallen victim to the rule of mammon. But perhaps those are not different things. To the extent that Jesus says in Luke's gospel, you can't have two lords, you cannot serve God and mammon. Maybe mammon is simply an expression of Satan as well. So maybe those are not two different things, as Green suggests. And so we get to our last verse here. Now that they've given him money, but notice it doesn't say he wanted the money or is pleased with the money. In the passage I showed you from Matthew, he becomes disgusted with himself for taking the money, but we hear nothing here about that. Perhaps the money and the silver here is just a way to seal the deal, but I have no reason to think that that's necessary either from a Judean perspective or a Roman perspective. They couldn't do what we might do, shake on it, so to speak, or just come to a quiet agreement, but they give him silver. So he consented here, exomologos, and that's a difficult word to translate in this context. It literally means, as you can see here, he shared the word. You can see logo as a logos there, and ex out. So he shared the word and began to look for an opportunity to betray him. And yet the same word is used, and only elsewhere here in Luke. What's translated in the New RSV, I thank you. But as my note there at 1021, highlighted in the video at the time noted, thank is a bad translation. That's a really weak connection. It's literally, I share this word with you. And so as Jesus shared the word with God about good news and rejoice in the Holy Spirit and revealing to infants, Here, the chief priests are rejoicing that Judas is willing to betray him, and he shares that word and looks for an opportunity to hand him over when no crowd was present. The word for opportunity here, eukaryon, literally means a good time, not like a good time, like a pleasurable time, but kairos, like the special time, in a good special time. It's only in Matthew in the parallel there, so there are some things, as we can see in the Matthew parallel here, looking for an opportunity to betray him. And yet Luke adds, when no crowd was present. And so certainly out throughout Jerusalem and the temple, the crowd would be present, so this is the opportunity they get to have a way to find Jesus when he's with his own people, but away from the crowd. And the narrator will now switch us back to the preparations for the Passover. So we as readers have privileged inside information now. We know about this conspiracy, but presumably Jesus and the others don't. So when the arrest comes, it will not surprise us that Judas is with the arresting party, but it will surprise the others. But we'll continue with this scene next time. See you then.